Welcome to the next in our beta lecture series for Church History 500. And in this lecture, we're going to be tackling Christianity as a persecuted religion. And at the end of our discussion here, I expect the student to be able to articulate the causes of persecution. Why were Christians persecuted? Was it just because they were Christian, or was their Christianness a problem for the Romans? Right? The student will examine the question of the lapsed. What about those people that apostatize? What did the church do with them? The student will evaluate the impact of persecution on the development of the church and its thought. So, the initial spread of Christianity never really appeared on the Roman imperial radar, at least in the early years, right? In its infancy, Christianity was treated as a sect or subdivision within Judaism, right? And it actually bore the force of Jewish persecution well before Roman persecution. And it was about the time of the Council of Jamnia where the Jewish leaders agreed to expel Christians from their fellowship, from the synagogues, right? And this is where Judaism affirmed the Old Testament canon. Because even as early as the Council of Jamnia, these New Testament Christian writings were cropping up, and Jews had to say, well, no, those are not authoritative for our religion. And we'll discuss the New Testament canon in a later lecture. The Roman Empire was always confused by Judaism, but it always had respect for Judaism. The Jewish religion was an old one. And if you remember Roman culture, mos maiorum, the tradition of the elders, Romans respected ancient practices. So even though the Romans didn't understand monotheism and the observances of the Jews, they respected its antiquity. The Romans also respected the fact that whenever the Jewish people were threatened, they took up arms to fight. Even when the Jewish people took up arms against the Romans respected that warrior spirit. If you remember back to Virgil's Aeneid and the thesis statement for the Roman Empire, to rule mankind and make the world obey, they actually saw something of that reflection within Judaism. So they respected it, even though they didn't always understand it, and they sought to rule over the Jews, right? But as we'll see, as Christianity spread, the Romans did not have the same respect for the Christians that they had for the Jews. First and foremost, Christianity was brand new. Actually, the Romans labeled it superstition and treated it like all the other superstitions that the Roman Empire dealt with. Christians, at least early on, tended to be pacifists. They would not organize and fight for their beliefs. When they were captured, they willingly gave up their lives to a Roman whose destiny is to rule mankind and make the world obey. That's insanity. Like, they did not understand that at all. Christians were taught in their scriptures to obey the earthly leaders. So, for a long time, there was no need for the Romans to use force against them. However, as Christianity grew, and as the values of Christianity increasingly conflicted with the values of the Roman Empire, or at least the values that developed within the Roman Empire, Romans sought to rule these Christians and make them obey. Now, a lot of people in the church assume that the Romans persecuted Christians because they wanted to ethnically cleanse them, to wipe them off the face of the earth, and that really wasn't the case. Early Christian persecution was local and sporadic, and later persecutions were attempts to produce apostates, not martyrs. They wanted people to convert to Roman paganism. They didn't just want to eliminate all Christians. But when we understand the Roman persecution of Christians, we need to divide it into two separate time periods, right? During the Roman Principate, 34 BC with Augustus through about 284, Christianity was statistically small, and efforts to suppress it was uneven, right? During this period, during the Principate, remember the Roman emperor took on this title princeps, first citizen or first among equals. In other words, the emperor was considered a colleague of the senators, not one who ruled over the senators. If the emperor wanted to do almost anything, they needed senatorial backing. But around 284, the Roman Empire entered a new phase. No longer the Principate, but the Dominate. Right? And under the Dominate, there was a universal program of persecution to try and convert the Christians back to Roman paganism. And at that point in time, if not conversion, then elimination. Right? During the Dominate, the emperor was no longer considered an equal to the senators. The emperor was considered one who ruled over the senators, and the emperor didn't need the Senate's backing to go to war or to make political changes. And the Dominate is interesting because beginning in AD 312, the Dominate converted from paganism to Christianity under Constantine. So the Dominate eventually actually became a Christian institution very early on in the Dominate's tenure. So in this lecture, we will discuss the nature of Christian persecution during the Principate, and then how it transitioned into a different type of persecution under the Dominate. So Roman persecution before AD 284 during the Principate, the first one to initiate a persecution was Claudius in AD 49. AD 49 was in the midst of the New Testament writing. The church was very small, but according to the Roman historian Suetonius, Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome, especially the followers of Christus, right? And this seems to be a misspelling of the term Christus, the Roman word for Christ. And we know that because Suetonius consistently misspells Christus as Christus, even when it's clear that he's referring to Christians. So apparently in Rome, Jews began to argue whether or not this Jesus truly was the Christ, truly was Christus. And it seems as if that turned violent. So Claudius had to expel the Jews from Rome, and at this period of time it was unclear if the Romans knew the difference between Jews and Christians, and everyone got expelled. And this is actually attested to in Acts 18:2. When Paul meets Priscilla and Aquila, they claim that they recently came from Rome because, quote, Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. So under Claudius, we don't have any martyrdoms. But there is independent evidence that Christians had popped up on the imperial radar, and they were treated as persona non grata, right? Most famously, the first violent persecutions was Nero. And when Rome caught fire, Nero blamed it on the Christians to deflect his own involvement. Because very quickly the citizens of Rome suspected that Nero started the fire around the Colosseum to clear more land so he could expand his palace. And even historians like Tacitus, who was no friend of the Christians, recognized that the Christians were being scapegoated. Let me read a brief paragraph. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite torture on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origins, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition. So Tacitus isn't friendly to the Christians, but he recognized that Nero was scapegoating them. He also recognized that the type of persecution Nero prosecuted against the Christians was severe. And there are reports that Nero would capture Christians, wrap them in oil-soaked rags, and light them on fire in the gardens as torches for his garden parties. But this persecution lasted only a couple of years, and it only applied within the city of Rome. It was not a universal persecution. Similarly, a few years later, under Domitian inaugurated a persecution against the Christians, but that too was limited and local. Even though Domitian was supposedly executed his own relatives, Flavius Clemens and Flavia Domitia, for being Christians. So very early in the first century, we get a little indication that Christianity had spread into the imperial family. Interesting. The next major persecution was prosecuted by Trajan. In AD 108, the governor of Bithynia, named Pliny the Younger, was a little confused as to how to deal with Christians, and he wrote to Trajan asking for guidance. There was widespread belief that these Christians were bad for Rome, but Pliny didn't seem to understand the legal basis for persecuting Christians. And there were some bizarre accusations that sound very funny to us today about why these Christians were bad for Rome. First, they were accused of being atheists. Not only did they not worship anyone in the comprehensive Roman pantheon, when you walked into a Christian church, there was no statue. You walk into any Roman pagan temple and there's a statue. You see, Jupiter, you see Mars, you see who you're making an offering to. You walk into a Christian church and there's nothing. So the Romans assumed they worship nobody, right? The next one's still bizarre, but a little bit more understandable. Christians were accused of being incestuous because they greeted one another with a holy kiss and they called each other brother and sister. Not a correct conclusion, but I can see how people would get from point A to point B on that one. I'll even admit, when I preach to my congregation, I joke, and it is a joke, that there is one direct command of Scripture I'm intent on never following is greet one another with a holy kiss. I promise I will greet none of you that way. I will greet no one in my congregation that way. I'm pretty sure a handshake is acceptable there. But we can see how Romans may have thought of incest there. Thirdly, and possibly most convolutedly, Christians were accused of being cannibals. Not because we supposedly ate the body and blood of Christ. Now, their path is much more circuitous. Because Christian Eucharistic ceremonies were private, only the baptized could participate. There were rumors about this secretive ceremony. So somehow people got it in their heads that Christians were baking infants into loaves of bread. And at communion, slicing these loaves with the baby inside and feeding it to the new members. And when the new members would discover what they had just done, they would be motivated to keep these ceremonies secret. Not really sure how they get to point A to point B on that one, but that seems to be the route that they took. So when Trajan replied to Pliny the Younger's letter, he didn't offer any universal guidance. He did suggest that Christians not be sought out. It's not the position of the Roman Empire to seek out Christians, nor was it the practice of Rome to act on anonymous sources. They were only to act if 2 or 3 witnesses were brought. In other words, there was due process for Christians even then. However, this letter did inadvertently set a legal standard that Christianity was in fact illegal in the Roman Empire, and this idea was perpetuated after Trajan's rule, and it caused problems for Christians even if it wasn't a universal persecution. Maybe the last of the persecutions under the Principate was Marcus Aurelius. And Marcus Aurelius is known as being a Stoic philosopher ruler, of not ruling by force or with an iron fist. And Aurelius actually mentions Christians once in his philosophical treatise Meditations, and he actually praises them for their willingness to give up their bodies. However, he was in favor of persecuting Christians because they gave up their bodies out of stubbornness, not for any rational, understandable reason. Aurelius thought they were insane, of just dying for nothing. And Aurelius thought that type of irrational behavior was a threat to society, so he endorsed their persecution. During Aurelius's reign, we hear a story of a martyr, Felicitas, and a quote from her that gives us a window into why Christians were a problem for Romans going forward. She said, "While I live, I shall defeat you, and if you kill me in my death, I shall defeat you all the more." And that attitude is a real problem for Romans. If you remember, Roman birthright is to rule mankind and make the world obey. How do you rule someone who says, "While I live, I shall defeat you, and if you kill me in my death, I shall defeat you all the more"? This was an upside down world for the Romans. And we kind of see why Romans came to the conclusion that these Christians need to die. But how do you rule a people that think they conquer through death? So as another Gordon Conwell professor, Ryan Reeves, has pointed out, that Nero and Trajan represent two different templates for Christian persecution. While persecution during the Principate was local and sporadic, sometimes it was very intense, like the Neronic persecutions. But other times, it was more of a legal reality that just kind of simmered below the surface of Roman society, like the persecutions of Trajan. But this would change with the Roman transition to the Dominate. So the persecution of Christians continued after the Principate, after about 284, into the Roman Dominate. And the emergence of the Dominate can be better understood when we look at what has been called the 3rd century crisis of the Roman Empire. Rome had been known for its stability and consistency. Rome is still today known as the Eternal City. But in the 3rd century, this stability began to fall apart. And it really began to fall apart with the death of Marcus Aurelius in 193. Rome then entered that year that's known as the Year of the Five Emperors, where several emperors were successively assassinated or executed. Eventually, Septimus Severus brought some stability to the Roman Empire, and he initiated an uneven persecution of Christians. Between AD 211 and AD 232, there were 4 failed coup attempts. And between AD 235 to 284, there was a fracturing within the Roman Empire that led to a Roman civil war. And during the 3rd century, Rome was at close to its largest expansion. And in the east, there was the Persian Sassanids. And the Sassanids grew in power and successfully wrested about a third of the Eastern Roman Empire away from Rome, Asia Minor, and down through Palestine. And that became part of the Sassanid Empire. And in the west, there was a Roman general who broke off the western third of the Roman Empire. So during this time, it's known as the Gallic Roman Empire, this threefold division within the Roman Empire. And the several Roman emperors tried to go to war to initiate reunification by military means, and they repeatedly failed. This turmoil continued until the accession of Emperor Decius in AD 249. And when Decius came to the throne, he inherited an emperor decimated by an economic crisis, threatened on all of its borders by barbarians and Persians, and there was a widespread decline in the ancient pagan religion. So Decius thought the key to restoring the glory of Rome was to return to Roman paganism, to promote unity within the empire through a return of worship of the pagan gods. Decius did not intend to make martyrs. He wanted to create apostates. He didn't necessarily want to kill Christians. He wanted to gain their allegiance under the banner of paganism. because Decius understood that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. Therefore, he required all to renounce Christ and burn incense to the pagan gods, and to obtain a certificate of sacrifice. Right? Let's see. After 35 years of relative peace, Christians had grown accustomed to not being martyred. During the civil wars, emperors were not so concerned about some of their internal divisions as they were concerned about the Sassanids and the Roman rebels to the west. So there was almost a complete generation of Christians that didn't have to worry about persecution. But when Decius instituted persecution to develop this nationalistic unity, as Gonzalez in our reading points out, there was a lot of Christians that were not prepared for that. This persecution died 2 years later when Decius himself died, but they were continued by Valerian, who started his rule in AD 253. And in between the reign of Decius and Valerian, there were 6 different emperors. And this only changed when Valerian tried to negotiate the reunification with the Western Roman faction. And when he arrived, the Western Romans killed their general and named Valerian as emperor, to which the senators, of whom Valerian was one, Valerian was a senator, the senators immediately ratified that. They thought this is great to have another senator to become emperor, and he reunified at least 2/3 of the Roman Empire. This would last almost 7 years, during which he imposed persecution on Christians. And in AD 257, Valerian sent a letter to the Senate asking them to outlaw Christians owning property, to ban Christians from the aristocratic class, and to ban Christians from serving in royal courts. And this is fascinating because it suggests that Christians had made their way into the aristocracy of Rome. It's no longer just a band of poor misfits that were dispersed from Jerusalem. That they had already been in the emperor's family. They were now serving in imperial government in the aristocratic classes. We don't know how widespread this was. The letter does not give us any indication of how many Christians may have been serving in the Roman Empire, but we do know some were, right? In AD 260, when Valerian tried to regain the eastern third of the empire, to regain the entire Roman Empire, he was defeated by the Sassanids, he was captured by the Sassanids, and he was used as a step stool for the Sassanid king for the rest of his life. In other words, every time the Sassanid king wanted to mount his horse, Valerian had to come and get on all fours so that the king could use him as a step stool. So the two emperors that promoted a universal policy of persecution, Decius and Valerian. Decius died very quickly. Valerian was humiliated before he died. That did not speak well of the power of the Roman pantheon, right? But what might be most fascinating for us to discuss is the response that Christians had to this persecution. And like we said, an entire generation went by without persecution, and a lot of Christians weren't prepared for it. So during the Dacian persecution, there was a number of responses by Christians to it. When Decius said that every citizen had to obtain a certificate of worship, different Christians responded differently. Some just went ahead and sacrificed either incense or animal sacrifice. And I'm sure a lot of Christians today knew what they were thinking. Well, I can just ask forgiveness and that's okay, right? But then I have my certificate. These Christians were known as the lapsi, those who lapsed. But during the Dacian and Valerian persecution, there were different types of lapsi. Some sacrificed animals, known as the sacrificiati. Others burned incense and became known as the furitectati. Others obtained fake certificates. They forged certificates and they became known as the Libellatici. And the Christians who refused any of these options, either flat out sacrificing animals, incense, what have you, or forging one, became martyrs. This produced a crisis within the Christian church, especially after Valerian died and the persecutions ended. What do you do with all those Christians who are willing to renounce Christ? Do you let them back into the church? Now, because we're in a society that has not had to deal with persecution on that level, I think it's easy for us to say, well, Jesus forgave Peter when Peter denied him, so let's just let everyone back in. At the end of a long process, that's kind of where they ended up. But at first, this was a very real issue. How do you think you would feel if you saw your mother and father executed for not denying Christ, and then welcoming people who did deny Christ back into the church when the coast was clear? I would imagine a lot of people might struggle with worshiping next to that brother or sister. And this struggle is represented in the story of Cyprian. Cyprian was a bishop of Carthage, and he understood his duty as bishop was to provide guidance, to shepherd his people through the persecution. But he said to himself, well, if I'm martyred, how am I supposed to lead people through the persecution? So he fled Carthage into the desert, and he was able to guide his church through the persecution, but from a safe distance. However, at the same time, Fabius, the bishop of Rome, was martyred for his faithfulness to Christ. He didn't flee. He stood and was killed. And Novatian assumed his role as the bishop of Rome. And Novatian criticized Cyprian for fleeing, accusing him of cowardice. And Novatian might have a little bit of a point there, right? Cyprian did defend his actions as the actions of a shepherd, and in fact he was actually very effective in guiding the church at Carthage through the persecutions. But we see three Christian responses to the lapsi, to these people who apostatized, especially after the persecution was over. First, the next bishop of Rome, Cornelius. Well, he was bishop of Rome during the same time as Novatian, because this question had actually produced rival popes in Rome. Cornelius allowed the lapsed readmittance with relatively few conditions. As long as they repent, they could be let back in. Another approach is represented by Felicissimus, and he advocated an even more lenient approach. Unconditional readmittance. No repentance, you can just come back in. But Novatian, the one who criticized Cyprian for his cowardice, advocated for readmittance only on one's deathbed. Only if they can prove that they will not reject Christ for the rest of your life can they be readmitted to the church. Interestingly, Cyprian, even though he fled Carthage, tended to see things like Novatian. Cyprian stated, "Whoever disassociates himself from the church is joined to a counterfeit paramour. He is cut off from the promises of Christ, and neither will he who abandons Christ's church attain to Christ's rewards. He is a foreigner, he is deconsecrated, and he is an enemy. He cannot have God as his father who does not have the church as his mother." And this would actually come up again in the Reformation, which we'll get to later on. This problem was compounded that now there were divisions in church leadership. Is it okay to accept communion from a bishop who had apostatized? If you were baptized by a bishop who advocated for the unconditional readmittance of the lapsi, was that a real baptism? So we can see how factions started to form in the church around this question of the lapsi. And the church worked to resolve this question. Cyprian thought that Christians should be rebaptized. But Stephen, another Christian leader from Rome, disagreed. So there was argument as to how to handle this. And in 256, the council was called in Carthage, Cyprian's hometown. And unsurprisingly, everyone agreed with Cyprian. So when the persecutions resumed, the question of the lapsi had still not been fully resolved. So there were two major consequences of this problem of the lapsi. First, the church started to move towards a more institutional understanding of itself. And the church began to define the boundaries of orthodoxy and salvation, that it could not be found outside the church. That membership belonging within the body of Christ, represented by the church, is required. Second, and this is different in different regions, in North Africa especially, the church, in Rome, the church moved away from purity as its standard of authority to unity as its standard of authority. And rather than seeing a church as a society of saints marked by consistently high morality, the Western Church had begun to see itself as an institution that welcomed the whole of society with rather minimal requirements for admission. And this is a quote, and I do not have where this quote comes from. Shame on me. I will do better. So the question of the lapsi forced the church into thinking of itself more as an institution, into promoting unity as a more important value than purity, and it became an agent of social transformation. Originally, the church was the school of the saints, and it started to transition into a society for sinners. But this question of the lapsi was compounded when we moved from the Principe into the Dominate, as we move from Decius and Valerian into the great persecution of Diocletian. And after 50 years or so of instability after Decius, Diocletian rose to emperorship through the military ranks. He was not a senator before like Valerian. This is very important because he would bring a military style rule to the imperial office, which is why we call it the Dominate, right? Diocletian was able to enjoy a relatively stable empire because he had no significant rival. He was able to stabilize the economy. That meant the aristocratic classes were happy with him. He did not see himself as first among equals. He saw himself as a ruler over the Senate. He did not feel like he needed the Senate's permission to go to war or to do anything. And this is when the army became the direct arm of the emperor. Previous, it was the army was commanded by the Senate, and every once in a while the Senate would appoint a dictator like Julius Caesar to lead the army in times of crisis. But now Diocletian emerged as this military general who was directly responsible for the army. In addition, Diocletian reorganized the entire empire in a very interesting way. And it became known as the Tetrarchy, or the Fourfold Empire. Diocletian recognized that the Roman Empire was way too large for any one leader to guard both of its borders, in the east and in the west. So he divided his empire into two, the eastern half and the western half, and in each half he installed a system of emperor and assistant emperor, so to speak. It was an Augustus, the lead emperor for that half, and the Caesar, the sub-emperor for that half. So you had two Augusti and two Caesars. All four would have to come from the military ranks. If one was a military general and the other three are senators, it would not be a stable situation because the general would just call up his army and defeat the other three. But no, all four had to be from the ranks of the army so that no one leader could get the sole support of the military. each would intermarry into each other's families to bind them with bonds of kinship. And while each half of the empire would have an Augustus and a Caesar, the Augustus and Caesar would rule from different cities. So even the Caesar, even though he's subordinate, had his own fiefdom, his own kingdom. So he wasn't treated like the vice president of the United States is, whose only job, he has two jobs, to break ties in Senate and to have a heartbeat, right? The Caesar was not the vice Augustus, he was the Caesar, right? This reorganization was actually very progressive, especially for a Roman Empire that valued antiquity, mos maiorum, right? And it was largely successful, at least until Diocletian abdicated, but we'll get there in a second. Despite the fact that Diocletian was politically progressive, he tends to be seen as religiously conservative. Diocletian was a military man, and the military, more than any other group in Rome, was dedicated to the worship of the pagan pantheon. Military leaders understood that success or failure on the battlefield might come down to one stroke of the sword or one trajectory of the arrow. And they were diligent in appeasing the gods so that they might have victory in battle. And because Rome had experienced a near century's worth of instability, Diocletian decided to unify the empire. The empire he just politically divided, he wanted to unify religiously around the Roman pantheon. So again, he required every citizen